There is no more important relationship than the relationship between the executive and the board of directors in terms of the long-term culture, efficacy, sustainability of an organization.
Hey everyone, this is Matt Kamen, your host of Nonprofit on the Rocks and co-founder of Envision Consulting with offices in LA, Denver, and New York. And today we are going to talk about all good things board building, which I'm really excited about. That is the whole agenda and the whole purpose of today's podcast. And with us, as always, is Ashley Watterson, our producer. Ashley, do you know anything about nonprofit boards? I don't think you've ever sat on one or given back to the world or care about the world even.
I know a thing or two about nonprofit boards, but only because my husband is executive director of a nonprofit. But no, I have not had the good fortune of sitting on a board yet. I keep looking for the right time, the right organization, because I do think it's really important work.
I feel like you missed the perfect opportunity to remind our listeners that your husband, Mark Watterson, who is episode 7 of season 1, is still the most downloaded episode of Nonprofit on the Rocks.
It is so true. I missed that opportunity, but fortunately you didn't. And actually, this is a good opportunity to remind our listeners that our shows exist in perpetuity, Matt. You can find all, 47 episodes that we've done of this show. So many wonderful leaders and nonprofit experts that we have talked to over the years. And so if you have missed any of our shows, go back to the catalog, folks. You can find them wherever you get your podcasts.
And I think what you're going to find in that catalog is how much better I am as a host and how much more mediocre Ashley is as a producer. I feel like that's pretty clear.
That is so true. It is a crazy trajectory. Like if you look at our intersecting graphs, there's a clear X. It's a precipitous incline for you and decline for me. I don't know. I'm sorry, everyone.
It's not great. So let's see how you do on this show today.
Let's see. So Matthew, I have a question for you. And I'm calling you Matthew because I had the good fortune of talking to your lovely sister last week. She called me because she knows you pay me in quarters and she's trying to hire me away. But it was so funny because when we were talking about you, which of course we were, and we were piling all kinds of crap on you, she was calling you Matthew. And it just cracked me up because I've never heard anyone refer to you as Matthew. And the question that I have for you, as I'm talking to your sister, I'm wondering where you fall on the whole worlds colliding thing. I don't know if you're a Seinfeld fan. There was the whole George Costanza, like he hated his worlds colliding. I personally love it. If I like one person over here that I play pickleball with, and I work with someone over here and a school mom friend over here, like I want everyone to meet. But I wondered where you fall in this category.
I really honestly think it depends. So I do love it that you talk to my sister. She does call me Matthew. And I wonder if she even listens to you know what? We're going to do a test here. So we've just called out Lauren. Let's see if she texts me at any time over the next, say, year that she heard you talk about her. But yeah, so I think worlds colliding could be both good and bad. Personally, it's great. I love it when worlds collide and people get to know each other. I have some really good friends out there. Some okay family. Again, we'll see if Lauren listens to the show. And then in terms of work, worlds colliding could be good and bad. Sometimes we play CEOs and board members, and then they don't get along. And then they come back to us and they say, I cannot believe you put us together. But sometimes they're like, oh my God, this is the best board member you've ever given us. I'm so happy.
You know, like I said earlier, my husband runs a nonprofit. So I see how many hats he has to wear and all the delicate balances in the ecosystem of the nonprofit world. But for sure, the same thing exists with boards and how boards have to navigate one another and work with the director. And it's the world's colliding thing, Matt. It's true to life in so many ways.
Worlds colliding, true to life. And this is our first show, Ashley, that we are specifically actually talking about something that Envision Consulting is doing, which I think makes my business partner, Allison Fuller, who was also, I think, the second most downloaded show on Nonprofit on the Rocks. And she's a very competitive person, so I know she's not happy about being number 2. Makes her very happy that we're talking about this.
Board Builders is an incredible program and idea that Envision is launching with the help of Jonathan, who I know is going to go into more detail about it on the show. But Matt, just right up top, why don't you give just like the quick pitch? Like, what is Board Builders?
Sure. So every single CEO or board member comes to us and says, how do we find new board members? How do we get board members to fundraise? How do we work together as a team? What if we have a bully on our board? We don't really love our executive director. How do we deal with this? We don't love our board chair. How do we deal with this? So Board Builders is all of it. It is a coaching program. It's a monthly subscription, and it's also quarterly happy hour events to find you new board members. It is such a cool program. I'm so proud of it. Again, this is the very first show in 47 shows that we are specifically highlighting Envision Consulting, and it makes me really happy. So I hope that our listener is going to enjoy the show, enjoy the stories, enjoy Jonathan and Amy, and hopefully stay to the end, to the outro with you and me, Ashley, to learn more about Board Builders. Hello, Amy Friedman and Jonathan Zeichner. How are you guys doing tonight?
Doing really well. Nice to see you.
Doing fine, Matt. It's good to see you. Good to see you, Amy. It's been a while.
It's been a while.
So for our listener, our one listener out there who has been dedicated to this show, you are the second show in over 40 episodes that we've done with two people. So I'm a little rusty, but hopefully this will go really well. And before we start, we love to talk about what we're drinking. So Amy.
I'm not drinking, but I'll tell you what, instead of drinking, I was up way too late last night. So I feel a little tipsy.
That's fine. That's fine. The more the better, because this whole show is about phenomenal horror stories. So the more I drink, the more I'm going to share. Jonathan, what about you?
Well, it sounds like you may be drinking for three, Matt, because I just moved and my liquor cabinet is empty. So I'm drinking a bubbly drink that has a lot of probiotics in it. So I'll be a little effervescent.
All right, well then I know my gift to you for moving into your brand new house in Hawaii that nobody should feel bad for you about will be some booze. So expect that in the mail. So before we get into phenomenal stories of board chairs and CEOs and like horror stories about boards, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the two of you. People should know who you are and your stories and how you got to this show. So Amy, if it's okay, I'd love to start with you.
Sure.
So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and why in the world are you in this nonprofit world?
Well, I'm kind of half a foot out of the nonprofit world, but I will say this, and this is where this configuration makes sense to me. Jonathan Zeichner is the person who made it possible for me to survive being an executive director for close to 10 years. And anything he asks me to do, I will do, because he's kind of a hero and a genius. The way I got into the nonprofit world was the way I think a lot of founders do. I am by trade a writer, and I've worked in various ways as a writer. And 30 years ago, I was a newspaper columnist. This was in Canada, in a town of about 100,000, so not a big town, but surrounded by prisons. And because I was curious about prison and really knew nothing about prison other than kind of what I watched on television, I decided I was going to go into a prison and find out what made prison work. And the notion I had was that I was going to interview prisoners, administrators, guards, families of, and so on, and do a series of columns about that. And I started, and all was going well when I met a man who was incarcerated, and he and I fell in love with each other. And we ended up getting married. There's a lot of story to this, but I'm going to try to be as succinct as possible. He had two daughters who, after we married, I raised. And he was still in prison for most of our marriage. We were married for 7.5 years. I learned a lot about prison, and I learned most of all the way loved ones of prisoners are stigmatized, shamed, silenced. I sort of went down a rabbit hole, I guess you'd say. And he and I divorced after 7.5 years. I never divorced the girls, so they were my daughters. And I think the thing that always was the most painful for me was the way they had been stigmatized and what that had done to them. They were very, very young when he went to prison. And I call them world-class liars because basically what they learned to do was just pretend they were different people. So they never had to talk about who their father was or where their father was or what they'd experienced. And so cut to 3 or 4 years after we got divorced, I remarried a man who was a high school teacher, who's my still husband. Last one, I'm done. And Dennis, as a high school teacher, I started going into his classes to teach personal essay writing and discovered in every single class that he taught, there were 1, 2, 5, sometimes 10 kids impacted by incarceration, the way my daughters had been, and kind of carrying around that same sort of shame and silence. And so Dennis and I came up with this idea of starting a club for kids who'd been impacted by incarceration. And we're going to bring this to every school in the country. And I knew exactly zero about nonprofits, but we did it. And it quickly grew. And then I learned what it meant to be an ED. And then I learned what it meant to work with boards. Anyway, the end of this story, the unhappy part of this story, is that after 9.5 years of running this and growing it and building it, and it was expanding around the country, a board fired me. And yeah, I think that's why I'm here to talk about that.
So we're definitely going to talk about these stories, but I have so many questions for you. And before we have a chance to get to Jonathan, I do want to know how you fell in love and married somebody who was incarcerated at the time. So, I mean, just to pry a little bit. So you meet this guy and...
My simple answer to this is I fell in love with him the way everybody falls in love with everybody. I'll tell you that I've written a memoir about this, so I've gone into the granular, and I'll send you a copy, Matt, because you'll probably want to read it.
Yeah.
But I was interviewing everyone in the prison, and basically what happened was he was the chairman of the inmate committee of the prison where I was, and we had one of those kind of like Katharine Hepburn, Spencer Tracy moments where he said, well, I don't talk to reporters because every time a reporter comes in here and writes about prison, we get fucked over. And I went, well, I'm not a reporter, I'm a columnist. But basically, we started talking to each other. He was actually the person who said to me, and I think it was the smartest thing anybody that I ever interviewed said to me, was if you want to know what prison is like, you should interview the families because they never did anything to hurt anybody and they know what prison is. And so he gave me this idea to come to this family social, and I came and I started interviewing families, and then he called me because he thought I hadn't come. And we had a conversation, and then it started. The way we ended up getting married was a little more dramatic and complicated. It's not that I don't want to say, but it's just complicated.
I cannot wait to read this book. Yes, so excited. We'll share the book when we publish this, so any of our listeners can read it. I have to tell you, so I ran a homeless shelter in New Jersey, and we had a program with the local jail where we housed a lot of the folks who came out, and their lives were like basically built for them to go back, right? Like they couldn't get jobs, they couldn't get housing. You know, even if they got a job, it was minimum wage. They could have made a lot more money selling drugs or doing whatever else they did before. And 80% of them went back to jail. So the world of reform of jails is really important to me. And so thank you for sharing. We will absolutely share that book because I think it's really important. And we'll get to that story of your board firing you in a minute. So Jonathan, you are the guy who's in charge of our Board Builders program, and I'd love for folks to know about you. So tell us why in the world you got into nonprofit and decided you wanted to be a CEO of a nonprofit.
Well, I don't know that I decided. I was, what do they say?
You were voluntold.
Voluntold. Well, look, you know, just as Amy just shared a story about her origin and entry into the nonprofit world, I find that everybody, especially founders, but almost everybody who really gets involved in nonprofits is doing so to address some of their own wounds or needs or the wounds of people that they love, or some cause that has moved them personally in some way. Because the work itself in a nonprofit, if somebody told you ahead of time what it would take, how many hours, and what kinds of trade-offs you would be making in your life with the people closest to you, your families, your children, your spouses, and how many meetings you would have to go to. If somebody told you all of those things ahead of time and what the pay scale was, you might not choose to do it. But as with so many non-profiteers, I didn't have a choice. I got involved because I had to. And the origin story for me has to do with my oldest brother, Adam. I'm one of four boys, and I was the third of four. So Adam was my oldest brother, and he ran away when he was 16, 17 years old. And when he came back, he was really entering a period of kind of blooming schizophrenia and bipolarism. He went into a very difficult, prolonged chapter of his life where he spent a lot of time on and off the streets and in and out of jails and psychiatric hospitals and homeless shelters. And I really adored my brother and admired him. He was extremely bright and talented, very artistic, a musician, a painter, a poet. And I just thought he was amazing and brilliant. When I started becoming an adult and thinking about what I was going to do with my life, I was pursuing acting in the theater and writing and directing. And I moved to LA from San Francisco and got involved with an organization that was doing theater-based work in psychiatric and homeless and prison settings. And I thought, well, this is an opportunity for me to integrate everything that's important to me in my life, my work as an artist, my work as a brother for Adam, and to try to make a difference in the lives of people who were struggling in the same ways that Adam was. And so I got involved with that organization. It was called Imagination Workshop, based at UCLA's Neuropsychiatric Institute. And within a few years, I was the artistic director of the organization. And in that organization, the artistic director was essentially the executive director. And that was the beginning for me. And I was there for 6 years, and then ended up co-founding a new organization that worked in the public schools in Los Angeles to bring multidisciplinary arts-based programming that we developed, very comprehensive curriculum, to work on socialization and communication and conflict resolution, and bring young people together from different parts of the city, different gang territories, different socioeconomic backgrounds, and ultimately creating original performances that focused on issues in their communities and in their lives. This program took off and grew quickly, and I went on to get hired as an executive director and a CEO. And now, as of the end of 2022, I'm no longer running organizations. I'm now working as a consultant and advisor for extraordinary leaders of organizations with many different missions that I feel inspired by, and also working with a lot of different boards. And I've built boards, I have sat on boards, and as a consultant now, I have an opportunity to be a fly on the wall and see boards at a number of different organizations, and whatever size they are, whatever budget they are, whatever mission they are, the boards have a lot of the same kinds of dysfunction and deficits. And so I had the opportunity to meet with you, Matt, and your partner, Allison, to work on expounding on an idea. And we're just launching it now as something that can be extremely supportive to nonprofit organizations in Los Angeles and beyond, on a lot of different levels that have to do with building their boards and helping their boards expand their capacity and their efficacy, et cetera.
So, like, here's the thing that I got out of the story. You've now moved to Hawaii and you've retired from being a CEO. How amazing does that feel? Like not running a nonprofit anymore, not dealing with the board anymore.
It's amazing. I just finished building a house. I was a general building contractor, so I got to do a lot of it myself. And literally a week ago, moved in. And yeah, it's great. But I will say this. Your question was, how good does it feel not to be running an organization and not to be dealing with boards? And I have had some challenging experiences with boards, no doubt, but I've also had some incredibly good experiences with boards. And I've learned a lot from both of those things.
All right. Well, I love that you are saying good things about boards, but I've got some really phenomenal horror stories and questions for the two of you today.
No
So many
doubt.
good ones. So many good ones. And what I think is really interesting, though, about a lot of folks who decide that they want to be CEOs or founders of nonprofits, it's a personal thing. It's a family thing. It's a life-changing thing. It's not just you decide one day you want to be an executive director of a nonprofit. There's a reason for it. You know, from my story, I got into nonprofit because my grandma taught me how to fundraise at the age of 6, and I loved it. And fundraising was always something that I just loved. And from her, I kept going. And then when I came out at UCLA, that's when I started my first nonprofit. So it was always, it's personal, right? And I think a lot of us are in nonprofit for that reason, not obviously for the paycheck, because it's usually not that great.
And that includes board members, by the way. So I think one of the reasons things can get so dramatic and kind of messy is because board members also, many of them are there with a personal mission and a personal agenda. And so you've got a lot of people who are trying to meet their own needs while they're also tasked with meeting the needs of the organization.
So I want to give you 2 personal things that happened to me with my board, and I'm curious what the 2 of you would have suggested to me if you were my coach, and then we'll go into your own stories. So I ran a homeless shelter in New Jersey, and my board chair was dating my board vice chair. And there were lovely times when arguments ensued at the board meetings. And I, as a 28-year-old executive director, had to navigate that. So if you were me, what do you guys do?
Well, that is incredibly unprofessional behavior. And so I think I would either pull the plug on the meeting and say, we're going to have to return to this very important issue in the future of the organization that we are all tasked with guiding and serving here. And I would have a separate meeting with this couple and with them as individuals if necessary, but with the couple, in which I would say to them, you know, what you're doing is harmful. And what you do on your own time is your business, but what you do in the boardroom and as representatives and ambassadors for this organization has an impact on the health and the future of the organization and the people that we serve. And if you can't separate and compartmentalize your personal life separate from your responsibilities as a board member, then I think you need to take a leave, and we will have to revisit what your capacity can be in the future. And of course, for a young executive director, that's not an easy thing to do, but that is an example of something where you have to put the organization before anything else. And you as the executive need to be the grown-up, right? Because they weren't being the grown-ups.
What about you, Amy?
I totally agree with you, Jonathan. One of the really important parts of being a board is to have like really upfront conversations about what your role is and what meetings are about and what you owe to the organization. And one of the things I feel most strongly about is that the relationship between the executive director and the board chair is the key. So in your situation, I would have actually said I need to meet with the chair separately, and that it was that person's responsibility to recognize the importance of the organization and possibly ask, was it the vice chair you said? Yeah, that person needed to step away. I think the personal can really intrude on the professional. And if you're a 2 against 1, you're going to lose.
So what ended up happening for me was that I became the therapist and met with them basically like in my office, but it was therapy, and they ended up cutting ties and breaking up and staying on the board together, and they were fine.
Oh,
And it was a
wow. You're a
very
good therapist.
like this would never happen in for profit, but unfortunately, this is the way life works. Okay, so here's my second question. Different organization. So I am at my gala. And we have worked so hard on this gala. I can't even begin to tell you. And I go to the bathroom ahead of, me giving a speech because I just needed a minute. I mean, there's like 500 people in the space, and I find my honoree having sex with my board chair in the stall, and both are married to other people. Okay. So I'm like about to give a speech, 500 people in the audience, honoree, board chair. Like I caught them in the act. Okay. You're me. What do you do, Amy?
Write a novel. That's my suggestion. I mean, in some ways, it's really interesting because it's the further extension of what I'm talking about these personal improprieties bleeding into the work. Like, yeah, I would write a novel. That's what I would do.
Well, I would say your galas are different from the galas I've thrown. I mean, that sounds pretty exciting, but I think what I would say to them is I expect the largest donation from both of you tonight in public. I mean, look, you have to be discreet. You know, what people do in the restroom with each other is their business. But again, if it is going to reflect poorly, if somebody else had walked in and seen that, a donor perhaps,
Or one of the spouses.
who knew both people, or one of the spouses, obviously it could have been a total disaster. But also, Matt, did they leave the stall door open?
It was a family bathroom. There wasn't a stall. And they didn't lock the door. I think they were just so hot and heavy. Here's the thing that I would say about events. Like, my perfect event is where you have an open bar. I want to get you drunk at my event, so you will give me money, right? That's what I want to do. And I got them too drunk. I walked in, I walked out, and yes.
They see you?
They saw me, yeah, of course. And the honoree got up when I handed them the award and said, well, I am pledging $100,000 tonight.
Oh, wow. Wow. You didn't even have to.
And I didn't have to say anything. And I never mentioned it except on this show. So yeah, that is my.
Can you say who it was? No, just kidding.
What would have been a better answer from you guys would have been like, maybe I would have joined in. That would have been a better answer. It was a fun event. And actually, what was very fun about that event was that my MCs were also wasted, but it wasn't my fault. They showed up wasted. So it was a very, it was a really messed up event. But we raised a ton of money, and isn't that what it's all about? Okay, so on that note, and I got many more of these questions, by the way, from my audience. Those were mine. Amy, you had mentioned that you were let go from one of your jobs by your board. Do you mind sharing that story with us?
Yeah, it's a complicated kind of layered story. I was fired in a really unprofessional way by people who behaved really unprofessionally all around. They fired me by text on a Friday night after first loading the board with friends. So like bringing in kind of allies, I think, with this intention. I believe there is such a thing as founder syndrome. I believe that I had some of the characteristics, a little bit of over controllingness, but I also believe there is such a thing as board syndrome that we don't talk about. And you've just described two aspects of board syndrome. But the other thing, I'm not going to talk about what this organization is, but I've served on a board and I've been at the other end of this story and kind of hate myself for my participation in passively allowing some bigger and louder board members to convince me that an executive director needed to be let go, and it was a mistake.
So that's a perfect segue, Jonathan. Let's talk about an ideal relationship. Let's talk about goodness for a minute before I go back to scary stories. So, in your opinion, the ideal goodness kind of relationship between an executive director and their board chair, what is it?
I will own to being a bit on the idealistic side, but first of all, trust, mission, transparency. And I know there's a movement that's been on for years to reduce the amount of communication, right? That people take too much time and board meetings are too long. And so you should really reduce everything. And I think that that all has value, but I also think there's a price that is paid when everything is reduced down to a decision. And that is the exchange of ideas. That's the price. And also coalescing around shared values. Why are we all here? What is the purpose? I have always had a habit at board meetings of having an empty chair and putting a teddy bear on it or something like it that symbolizes the people we are there to serve. And I always say, look, anything that we say and do and the way we treat each other is something that we should feel we could do in front of the constituents that we serve. And if you can't, then there's something wrong. And it doesn't mean that you can't have confidentiality and that you can't keep things private until they're ready to be shared or deal with on a case-by-case basis things that should not be publicized. That's not my point. My point is that I would rather the board or the board chair make sure that they really understand what's going on. That's one of the things that I have seen that I think is really unhealthy in nonprofits is when the executive is in the position of being a go-between between the board and donors, the board and the staff, and the executive basically is filtering everything and spinning everything, whether intentional or not, to make it work, as opposed to providing a container and a culture where people can be open and transparent with each other and up to speed with each other in a way that allows everybody to make informed decisions that are values-based. Being an executive director is a lonely position. And at the end of the day or the middle of the night, when you're awake because there's a problem that seems insoluble, there's a cash flow issue that you haven't figured out how to solve yet, an employee is in trouble, there's litigation on the horizon. I mean, all of these kinds of things that nonprofit executives deal with routinely. You need somebody that you can rely on to share that burden with you, to brainstorm with you, to help take responsibility, and also, frankly, to cover yourself in terms of liability. So that relationship between the board chair and the executive, which is a center point for the Board Builders initiative that we are launching right now through Envision, it's key, right? It's key. And it has a huge impact ultimately on the organization, the culture of the organization, the efficacy of the organization. And at the end of the day, when an executive leaves, if that relationship hasn't been a healthy relationship, then there's all kinds of skeletons and cleanup that the next executive or the next board chair needs to deal with. So transparency, trust, and contemporaneous sharing of information, I think, are really key.
Yeah, I agree. And, we as nonprofits should be representing our core values. And if the board and the CEO and how everybody interacts does not reflect the core values of the organization, we have a problem. That's something always that I try and remind my clients about is like, what are your core values and do you bring those to the boardroom? And on that note, I have a question from a listener. So her name is Jenny. She's in Arkansas. I'm going to send this to you, Amy. Her question is, my relationship with my board chair is incredibly toxic. We do not get along. He is extraordinarily difficult. And in every board meeting, it's very uncomfortable. It is affecting the morale of the board and it is affecting the morale of my staff. What do I do?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's really important to address it. I've noticed that more women executive directors come up against this sort of thing, and frequently with male chairs. I don't want to make too many grand statements about that, but I think there's elements of sexism involved that's just kind of innate, and we're all guilty of sort of manifesting some of the characteristics that make these things toxic. I think Jenny ought to try to have an open conversation with him about the very fact that it seems that they are not getting along, and discuss the possibility of his considering bringing someone in, a co-chair, maybe. I had the good fortune of having a coach in Jonathan, and I had a couple other coaches as well. And they were people to whom I would bring this problem and kind of brainstorm the best way to approach that specific person. I don't know the specific circumstances or how many board members there are, or how long each of them have been in their roles and so on, but it needs to be addressed. And if Jenny has someone to kind of brainstorm possible avenues of addressing it, that's where I would begin.
So a coach. Okay. We have a prospective client, Jonathan, to Board Builders, and he is in New York City, which is exciting. And so this is to either one of you. His question is, I hate my board chair. I hate my board chair. I hate my board chair. 3 times, by the way. And I cannot seem to get anybody to take his place. He has been my board chair 2 terms, a total of 4 years, and it's killing me. And no one else on my board will agree to take him on to become the next board chair. I'm getting to the point where I can't take it anymore. What can I do?
I've seen this when you have a board where no one will take over a role, that it's time to find other board members. If people are recalcitrant about serving as officers, and this is where those agreements come in handy, that the board do a self-analysis, including reviewing the ED, which is one of their jobs, and doing that annually and having open conversations about that, but doing a self-analysis. And if this board did that, they would see we're missing some important members here.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's a really tough situation. And of course, we don't know all the details about why they hate their board chair 3 times over. I would want to get to the heart of the matter, over a glass of wine, whatever, and just say, look, you and I are having a hard time with each other, and it's impacting the work. And even if it's not overt, we know that we're not being open with each other. We're not setting an example in terms of how we relate with each other for the other board members. And we have to figure out a solution to this for the organization. My structure I prefer is a board chair and 2 vice chairs. There's reasons for that having to do with succession planning and kind of deepening the bench and getting people prepared so that you don't get into the situation that your listener has just shared, which is nobody will step up. So you need to preempt that and never get to that place where nobody will step up, because there needs to be a succession plan all along. And that's something that we do talk about in Board Builders and have some support for. But you shouldn't get to the place where you have people behaving so unprofessionally in a board meeting. And why would you not get there? Because you have set a culture with clear expectations and support and modeling examples of how to do it. And that includes onboarding. All board members should be onboarded in a methodical way that lets them know what's expected of them. They should come and audit a board meeting. There's no need to be in a hurry. There's so much artificial urgency in the nonprofit sector. Everything is urgent. There's very little delineation between the urgency of one thing and the urgency of something else. There is no more important relationship than the relationship between the executive and the board of directors in terms of the long-term culture, efficacy, sustainability of an organization. And as an executive, you should always be planning your succession. Always. And you should be preparing the organization to be without you. And the bridge between where you are now and where the organization is now and where they need to get to, the bridge is the board of directors.
I love what you just said, because it's yet another reason to hire Envision Consulting in terms of succession planning and bringing in a new CEO. I love it all. Okay, so let's talk about those board meetings, because that's what you just talked about a little bit. And we have a lot of questions from board members about board meetings. So I will tell you, I feel like everything I do revolves around booze. I may have a problem, John. But my favorite board meetings that I did when I was in ED was I did them at board member houses. So we never did it at a boardroom. We never did it at an office. We did it at one of their houses because all my board members were actually very rich. And they had food and wine, and we had like a nice conversation. Only one time did one person get out of hand and they had too much wine and it was a problem. He happened to puke on the table, but that's a whole other story. So again, all my stories around booze. So I'm curious for the two of you, from a lot of our listeners who have this question as board members, what do you think is the best way to have a board meeting?
Not on Zoom. I mean, I'll start there. I think it's really important for people as often as possible, as comfortably as possible, to be able to meet in person. I think Zoom is a really hard place to build trust in a group. World of difference meeting in person than meeting virtually, to me.
Jonathan?
Well, I think there's more than one way to run successful board meetings. So I think meeting at a home, meeting if you have a facility where you provide your services, I think meeting there at least once or twice a year is really important. When I had the meetings at my facility, I would also have presentations by staff, sometimes by constituents as well, because I want the board members to feel the fulfillment and the gratification and to see what their efforts are producing. One of the things I'm always thinking about with board members is how to keep them in touch with the mission and in touch with the things that inspire them. Board retreats, I think, are really, really critical and should not be seen as just long board meetings. Celebrate if there are things that need to be celebrated, including things with the board themselves. Was there a marriage? Was there a baby? Was there a promotion? It doesn't need to take a lot of time, but it's a way of making people feel good and feeling like they're part of community, that they're not just there to check boxes and make decisions and spend money. And food is important. I didn't always have alcohol. Sometimes if we were celebrating something, I would, but I definitely, when we were meeting in person, always had dinner. So our board meetings were started in the late afternoon, and I would always have dinner catered ahead of time. And people could come a little early, get their dinner, schmooze with each other a little bit, and then head into the meeting. And once we head into the meeting, we used the agenda and we plowed through the agenda. I like 90-minute board meetings. 2-hour board meetings are acceptable, especially if it's a budget meeting. And I like to start on time and end on time, even if that means leaving some things on the table, and then getting minutes out within a couple of days of the meeting and including a to-do list and holding people accountable, making sure that everybody understands what they're accountable for. So all of those things are important. And I think, again, warmth, mission, values, camaraderie, and professionalism, and most importantly, getting the work done for the organization so that everybody walks out of that meeting feeling like it was a good use of their time. They were included. And that's another thing, is making sure that the people who don't speak up, if you have to, you say, Matt, what do you think? And you put them on the spot in a gentle way. But
Amen to that.
Yeah.
What I really enjoy doing at board meetings, and I'm not a board member now. I think about it, but I still am not a board member. Are either one of you board members now of nonprofits?
I'm just drifting off.
And
I
you are.
am, but about to not be.
Yeah, I'm a board member for a very small nonprofit in a small rural town in Hawaii, and it's a struggling organization. So it's really interesting.
My favorite board meetings are when we talked about a success story and we talked about a failure and how the nonprofit actually failed and what we learned from that. And then we talked about very specific strategic things. So it wasn't reading through minutes, it wasn't reading through reports. It was actually talking about like what's exciting and what we can do better, and are we actually making an impact, and how we can actually do things as board members. So I really wanted to make my board members feel like they're important, but also remind them of what they needed to do. And on that note, we have a question from the board chair. And the board chair's name is Ted, and he's in Iowa. I love all these listeners around the country. I really do. It makes me so happy. So Ted's in Iowa. He's not telling me where. And his question is, hey, I am very happy to go out and fundraise, but my board refuses to fundraise. As board chair, how do I give them the inspiration? How do I give them the knowledge? And how do I force them to actually go out and fundraise?
So, Ted, I feel you, because one of my issues with my board was they decided they were not a fundraising board, that they were a working board. Some people will never be good at it. And I think it's important to recognize that some people give other things more time, maybe more capital in other ways. Matt, I was really interested that you said you learned how to fundraise at 6. I did not. And I came to fundraising very late and kind of kicking and screaming a little bit, but I did learn one thing from one board member who said it's so much easier to fundraise when you give, that it's really important for you to be participating in this giving side of things. And the minute I got that, and the minute I started giving more money to a level that was comfortable for me, it's a meaningful gift for me. The minute I did that, it just unlocked this fear. But I think some people will just never be able to do it. I think some people are just really uncomfortable. And then you've got to get people who are really comfortable and good at it and have them work with the people who aren't and kind of share the knowledge.
I just want to say one thing to Amy. So here's what happened with me in fundraising. My grandmother, who had polio and grew up in poverty, came to LA, and somehow, I have no idea, for a woman with polio in the 30s in LA, was able to make whatever money she was able to invest in real estate and start making an empire for herself, and then gave back to charity, right? She instilled in me and my mom that. She used this 6-year-old face to go out and sell raffle tickets for her nonprofits. First of all, she knew what she was doing, but I loved every minute of it because I was able to go out there and get people to buy raffle tickets, and it didn't, like, I was 6. So that is how the fundraising bug started. And she was smart. She knew what she was doing. And so, yeah, that's how it worked.
I just want to add one little add on to that, because the minute you said that about learning when you were 6, we did a fundraiser once at a restaurant, where like people who came in, if they said the name of your organization, some percentage of their meal was kicked back to the. And one of my friends came with her 6-year-old daughter, and her 6-year-old daughter was a kick-ass fundraiser. She just would go, hey, this is Pops, you need to give. And everybody gave because she was irresistible.
Yeah, who says no to a 6-year-old? My grandmother knew. So that's where I learned. Anyway, sorry, Jonathan.
Well, yeah, 6-year-olds and puppies, right? They make it easier to raise money. Fundraising is part science and part art. And if you do the science part, if you really do the diligence on it, and you can set it up, and you can make it not necessarily 100% easy for people who feel a little uncomfortable about it, but you can help engineer it so that they get some wins. And what I have found is that people who say, I hate fundraising, I'm terrible at it, I don't do it, once they have a couple of wins, they raise 20 grand, 50 grand, or whatever, they're like, maybe I can do this. And so money is just one of those weird things. It's a medium, it's symbolic, and there's all kinds of old axioms about, if you ask for advice, you get money. If you ask for money, you get advice. How do you not leave money on the table? You can tell the moment you ask for something by somebody's response, whether you ask for too much or too little. And if it's too much, they'll come back with another number. And if it's too little, they'll go, oh, sure. Then you're like, damn. So I think it's a very nuanced thing, but the bottom line is you're not asking for the money for yourself. And I think people get so uncomfortable about asking for money. But if they start thinking of it as, what, I got to tell you, it's classic sales, but I want to tell you about an organization and a cause I really care about. And people who know me know I'm not wealthy, but I say, what, I give. And I'm sitting on the board of this organization because it's making a difference, and I believe in it. And if you would join, that would mean a lot. But some people are brilliant at it, like you, Matt. You can ask anybody for anything, and it's very clear that you're not squeamish about it, and it's not for you. You're not taking a vacation to the Bahamas. You're advocating for the organization.
Jonathan, why I'm so good at fundraising. It's because nobody can say no to this face. That's what this is. Let's be
You
honest.
still look like you're 6 years old,
Let's
and
be honest.
yeah.
Let's be honest. So there are so many more questions, but I'm gonna just focus on a few left. So when I took over 2 of the nonprofits that I ran, the previous CEO had stolen money, and the board didn't know how to deal with it and didn't actually fire them for that. So this question is from a board member who said, hey, our executive director is not doing their job, and I, as one sole board member, do not feel like she should be in charge anymore. But I don't know how to tell the rest of the board this, and also how in the world do we fire our executive director?
Well, I can put you in touch with my board. They can tell you how to do it. I know a lot of boards who don't have that problem. Well, that we haven't really talked about this, but the 360s or executive director reviews are definitely where to begin. And if you're not doing those regularly for both sides, honestly, that's where transparency kind of comes to play. If this board member feels strongly that the executive director is not doing their job, they need to be transparent about their experience of that and show how, where, in what ways, and so on. And other people need to participate in that review. And there needs to be a conversation between the board and the executive director around that review. In my experience, one of the things that was so traumatic for me being fired was there was no transparency from anyone. And had there been conversation and legitimate, transparent reviews of what kinds of problems people were having with me and the things that they wanted different, it's not that I necessarily wouldn't have gotten fired. Maybe I would have, but it wouldn't have been completely lacking in transparency. It wouldn't have been a trauma.
Well, I agree with that 100%. It is your responsibility if you think that the executive is not performing as needed and the organization is suffering because of it. It must be confronted. I would suggest that happens first privately, a meeting between you and your board chair. Probably the next thing that would happen is a conversation between the board chair and the executive. And that goes back to that relationship and trust and transparency, but also recognizing the responsibility that the board and the board chair have. The executive works for the board. The executive is accountable to the board. The board's job is to protect the organization, and that includes protecting it from within.
So my last 2 questions for the 2 of you. Being a board member, you take on an enormous amount of responsibility. I don't think most board members understand what they're liable for. I don't think they get it. And when you're a board member, you as a board are in charge of the organization. The buck stops with you, but also you can be sued. And none of the boards that worked with me knew what was going on. They didn't know the budget, they didn't know the financials. One of the organizations that I ran out of money and had stopped paying staff, didn't pay staff payroll for 3 months. And part of that meant that they didn't pay payroll taxes, and the board itself was liable for that. There was no insurance that covered them. So here's my question for the 2 of you. On behalf of people who are looking to join a board, why in the world? You gotta hire a CEO, you gotta fire a CEO, you gotta do a 360, you gotta do all these things. Why in the world should you become a board member?
I think if you're someone who understands the import of board work and what it means and what kind of homework it requires, what kind of work it requires, if there's an organization, the mission of which you feel passionate about, then it can feel really good to be that person who's helping steer the boat. So I think it can feel really meaningful and empowering exciting, and it's a way to make the world better.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a bottom line, which is why do you do anything that's hard? Because you believe in what you're trying to accomplish, and you have a unique ability to make a difference and make yourself useful. I don't love sitting on boards, but I have a wealth of experience and understanding of nonprofits, and I think it's a way to provide value. I don't want to be staff at a nonprofit. I don't want to run a nonprofit, but I can be useful in that way. And so I do it out of a sense of obligation. And I don't say that in a negative way, but I do it because I think it's my responsibility to use the tools that I've accumulated over the years to make a difference. And I see the need. I also think that one of the best parts of being on a board is the people, because I find that by and large, people who are attracted to nonprofit and who are willing to volunteer to sit through these meetings and make decisions, they're just great people. So
Yeah.
I really enjoy being around other folks who are trying to make a difference and contribute. And I do think, going back to board builders, there's a need to raise the bar and provide the guidance, the expertise, the tools, the collateral, the structure for boards to work better. Because I think when people have miserable experiences on boards, it's because the boards aren't being run properly. If you're building a board from scratch, do it really thoughtfully and mindfully. Don't just take anybody because you want to have names on your board. And set it up in a way that supports them, because they are volunteers. I really had such tremendous affection and respect for the board members who sat on the boards for the 3 different organizations that I ran. These people were volunteering. They were giving one of the most precious things they have, which is their time. I think that the whole concept of nonprofit boards has some systemic problems with it, but the process of it is one that allows good people to come together, work in community around shared values, and make a difference. And I love that.
Yes, agreed. Like, there's no other place that you can volunteer to do good and see the results and make an impact. You're right. Okay, so final question. All 3 of us are founders of nonprofits, and we have been leaders of nonprofits, and by the way, also sat on boards of nonprofits, which is interesting. So, as you said, Jonathan, I think being an executive director of a nonprofit is lonely. You've got so much that you have to deal with. I mean, 2 of the nonprofits that I ran, I didn't pay myself for like 3 months. One of the nonprofits I ran, I personally put the money up for payroll because there was no money. So it's a lot. And you will never do that in a for-profit job. You will in a nonprofit. And you got to deal with the board. You got to deal with donors and clients and staff and all the things. So my last question for both of you as EDs, why in the world should somebody want to be an executive director, and what do they need? What kind of support do they need from their board to be able to be successful?
I'm not sure I'm a great person to answer that right now, because I think that I'm still sort of traumatized by the experience that I had. That said, I would not trade those 10 years for anything. The work and the difference that I believe the work we did made in many individual lives is still like one of the happiest things I've ever experienced. And I think what EDs need is to make sure that they have a staff and a board from whom they feel support, that sense of trust and focus on the mission, and an ability to be honest. And this is something actually, Jonathan, that you kind of modeled for me, was an ability to put the ego aside and to be willing to hear anything people had to say, like to really be able to listen to other people's needs, and that other people might see things really differently, and not be so rigid that criticism breaks you, but that it builds you.
Yeah. Well, it is a it is a very singular job. You know, I've been a general contractor, I've been a movie director, and I've been an executive director for nonprofits, and they're similar, those three things, because you're problem solving all the time, and anything at all can happen and come your way. And you have to think very quickly while also being strategic and having a plan. And why do it? Well, I think going back to the beginning of our conversation, you asked a similar question. And I think you do it because you must. You do it because you are driven by the mission and the cause. I would never take a job as an executive director for an organization whose mission I did not feel passionate about. I can't criticize people who do that. For some people, this is a job and they're really good at it and they can plug and play wherever they are. And that's great. But in terms of taking on the responsibility that's involved to run an organization, to impact employees and constituents, to hold the trust of funders and partners, and to stand in front of this mission and talk about why it's important and how great it is. I think for me, I had to be driven. I had to feel like there was no choice but to do this, and that I was going to learn along the way, because I didn't even know what an executive director was when I first became one. There's an old saying, which is find something you would do for free and figure out a way to get paid for it. I think for me, that was the case. I got paid so little for so many years, but I don't regret an instant of it. I loved every second of it and felt that I was on purpose. And so if you care about being on purpose and applying yourself in a way that makes the kind of difference that you think is important, then being an executive director is an incredibly challenging and rewarding experience. I think it's a great job. Is it hard? Yeah. Can it burn people out? Absolutely. Are you going to get rich doing it? Highly unlikely, but I loved every second of it.
All right. Is there anything else the two of you would like to leave with our listener before we let you go?
Well, I think the thing I would do is go back and talk a little bit about this initiative that Envision has created, and I've had the good fortune to be able to collaborate with your staff, Matt, on putting this together. I really do think that boards can do better. And I think that there are some ways across the board to raise the bar. And then there are idiosyncratic and individual ways that each organization needs support. And I'm really excited about this initiative. And I hope that people will take advantage of it. It's a subscription service. There are different levels. So depending on the budget of your organization, you can get involved and participate and find a way to afford it. And we're also looking for funders to start underwriting this opportunity for nonprofits who would have trouble paying for the subscription. And we're going to learn a lot along the way. It's not done. It's a work in progress. And so that's what I would leave this with, is just a little bit of an invitation and a sales pitch for folks who are listening to check it out. You know, you can go online and look for boardbuilders.net or causecoaching.net. They'll lead you to the same website, and just see what it's about and be in touch if you have questions. I think building the community of leaders in nonprofit is part of the process that we're doing with the roundtables and so on. And I'd love to see more people get involved. So that's my parting shot on that. And thank you. It's been fun. And Amy, it's been great to see you and see where you are now, because it was a traumatic experience and nobody deserves to be treated the way you were treated, period.
So thank you. And I want to say, I can't wait to learn more about board builders. I really honor both of you for this work you're doing. I'm excited to learn more about it, and love that you, Matt, created a forum for being able to be open about all the shitty things that can happen, right? What I've found most interesting is how a lot of people in the nonprofit world have not wanted to hear from me, because hearing a trauma story just feels bad. So when Jonathan asked me if I'd be willing to be on here, I was delighted. And I think it's very brave and wise of you to have a forum like this. Talk about transparency, right? It's important.
First of all, thank you. I'm sorry for everything you went through. And, the whole purpose of this show is to help nonprofits do better. And I mean, I love horror stories and I love fun pulls of board chairs and honorees having sex in the bathroom and things like that. But also, it is really hard to be a board member. You don't know what you're supposed to do. And it's hard to be an executive director. You're alone. And so the fact that we can have a show like this and have a conversation and hear from experts and people who have gone through it, and the fact that we can learn from each other is really important. So I thank you both so much for joining me. And to all of our listeners across the country who were able to ask questions, I thank you. And I hope you two both have a very dry, I'm drunk, but you both have a very dry rest of the weekend. Thank you.
Well, it was fun. Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, thanks both.
Hey, Ashley.
Hey, Matt.
So, would you sign up for Board Builders if you actually cared about the world and were on a nonprofit board of directors?
Of course I would. Are you kidding me? Like, after hearing this episode, I don't know how anyone who runs an organization or is looking to support an organization would not be interested in Board Builders.
Yeah, I agree. I kind of feel a little bit like, remember back in the day, you'd be up at like 1 a.m. and that commercial would come on and it'd be like, if you sign up right now, you get a second pillow for free. And that's kind of like what I'm feeling. Right. If you sign up right now for Board Builders, you get a second one for free. But it is something, though, that I am really proud of. And hopefully you are listening to this at 2 a.m. in bed and enjoying the show and thinking about, you get a pillow for free, too.
So what I'm hearing, Matt, is that we need to be advertising for Board Builders on QVC. That's what I'm hearing.
God, I love that idea. That would be so great. Think about how many people across the world could see my face. How great would that be? That changes the world.
Yes, Matt, you will be the next, well, dare I say, the My Pillow guy?
No, as a matter of fact, absolutely not. But thank you. I appreciate how you feel about me. You can go work for my sister since you guys were talking about whatever it was you were talking about last week.
I'm officially on notice. Lauren, if you're listening, text Matt and let him know you're interested in taking me off his hands, because clearly this might be the end for me.
So, for any of you really out there who are listening, who are interested in learning more about board builders, who have questions about their board, who want to bring on new board members, who don't quite know how to run a board meeting or how to be interesting or how to fundraise or just want some coaching, please, please, please check us out. Go to our website at envisionnonprofit.com. You can also just call the office and ask to talk to me. You actually get to talk to me in person or anybody really in our team. Our number is 626-714-7577. Again, 626-714-7577. And you get a pillow for free if you call.
Does the pillow have your face on it?
Of course. What kind of question is that?
I love it. Matt, one last thing before we let our listeners go. I was just so surprised to learn in this episode that you ran a homeless shelter in New Jersey. I had never heard that story before. It came up a couple of times and I was like, oh my gosh, I've got to remember to ask Matt more about that.
Just in case anybody has a question about what Ashley is just doing, is that every single episode, somehow I throw in the fact that I ran a homeless shelter. And I cannot tell you, my dear listener, how much shit Ashley gives me on a regular basis for talking about work that I'm proud of. But what that goes to show you is Ashley doesn't care about the homeless. Ashley doesn't care about the world. Ashley doesn't care about nonprofits. I don't even know why you're here, Ashley. That's what I'm getting out of this whole thing.
I am sure that the listener took that exact thing away from what I said. They knew how to read between the lines. In all honesty, though, it is interesting how that work, which obviously was super important work and super important to you, has applied in so many different ways on the show and the things that we've talked about. The work you've done there was obviously really expansive and it was formative for you, because wasn't it your first director job?
It was my first executive director job. I had a lot of fun doing it. and learn so much about it. And, I'm just happy to be able to use those stories and all kinds of stories to highlight how hard it is to be a CEO or executive director, how much work it takes to be a board chair, and how much fun you actually can have if it's done correctly. You got to be able to all work together.
And I think that's what you and Jonathan and Amy all said across the board, no pun intended. You all talked about so many different challenges and horror stories and difficult things. And yet all three of you kept coming back to it's worth it.
Yes, 100%. The work is worth it if it's done well and you have a strong team. Think about all the things that we could do together. So hopefully people enjoyed the episode. People enjoyed hearing stories. People enjoyed learning about all the things that we could do better. And maybe, just maybe, somebody might call us up and ask to join Board Builders. And if they do, they'll get a nice evening sleep on their new pillow.
With Matt's face on it. It's my dream come true.